I was awakened the next morning by my little sister, who came in to shut off the alarm clock that was ringing right next to my pillow. "That sure is noisy, isn't it, Shami?" Shami-san was curled into a ball at the foot of my bed. My sister picked the fur ball up, then shoved him against my nose. "Are you gonna have breakfast? Her tone-deaf sing-song voice penetrated my head way more sharply than the alarm. Yeah. My sister was moving Shami-san's paws around like he was a puppet. I brushed them aside and sat up, taking Shami-san out of my sister's arms and putting him back on the floor. The cat sniffed in irritation, then climbed up into my bed. As I was getting dressed, my sister started pinching Shami-san's furry cheeks, then escalated to grabbing at his angry, twitching tail. Finally, he let out a meow of protest and ran out of the room, my sister chasing closely behind him. I wished they wouldn't start fighting in my room first thing in the morning, although they had gotten me out of bed, I had to admit. I was on my way to the bathroom when I encountered them again, my sister this time having draped Shami-san around the back of her neck. Kitty scarf! But I ignored them entirely. I glared at my tense face in the bathroom mirror as I brushed my teeth, wondering just what holiday it was today. Not that it mattered. I cursed the cold wind that whistled by outside and wondered when spring would finally get here. I wished I could just keep being a freshman whose face nobody knew, without repeating a year, that is. But I was sick of the cold weather. Both treasure hunting and random city excursions would have been a lot more inviting in a warmer season. But it was February. Frickin' February. But no matter the month, once Haruhi said we were doing something, we were doing it, one way or another. We were just lucky she hadn't decided she wanted to salvage an ancient shipwreck at the bottom of the sea. Had to stay positive. Once I finished eating breakfast, I put on a jacket, given that I would be going hiking soon, then headed out for the local train station on foot. I didn't bring my bike, since the only way to get to City's Mountain from the station was to take a bus. It would have been faster if we'd just met up at the mountain, and the only reason we were meeting at the station was out of a sense of tradition that wasn't even worth mocking. I buried my face in my muffler. The north wind was so bad, it felt like it had a bet with the sun it was determined not to lose. I wasn't walking particularly quickly, but this was because I had left myself plenty of time. No, it was that no matter how punctual I was, I'd still be the last to arrive. This was another stupid tradition. There'd only been that one time when I'd gotten to wait for somebody else. It was about 5 minutes to 9 when I arrived at the station. I found all the familiar faces of the SOS Brigade already waiting. Haruhi wore an expression that looked like it had been handed down by Old Man Winter's grouchy boss. "Why are you always the late one, huh? Everybody else was already waiting for me when I got here. Don't you feel bad making your brigade chief wait?" Oh, Haruhi was definitely the one who made me feel bad. For one thing, the reason the other 3 members arrived before she did was to make her treat everybody. The only reason she didn't have to was because of me. So I wish she'd feel a little bad for once, I told her. "What are you talking about? You're the one who was late," said Haruhi, grinning. "What's your problem? You seem like you're worried about something. Is something up?" It wasn't just something. We'd finally get a holiday, but here we are out in the freezing cold looking for treasure we're never going to find. Or so I was just lamenting my own misfortune, I said. "Well, cheer up, or did Shami-san's sickness come back?" "No," I said, tucking my chin down and looking sideways. "It's just cold." Haruhi chuckled and held her hand out as though explaining something she thought was obvious. "You just gotta adapt to the environment. So today, that means switching to winter mountain climbing mode. Easy, right?" I wasn't a plastic model, so I couldn't just swap out parts like that. Humans didn't have mode switches anywhere on them, although I couldn't be sure about the all-weather Haruhi. While Haruhi and I were exchanging our morning greetings, the other 3 members stood there in observation mode. Koizumi, Asahina, and Nagato were dressed in casual, basic, and natural outfits, respectively. Nagato's natural look consisted of a duffel coat over her school uniform, and while there was nothing to say about what part of that was particularly suitable for hiking, I suddenly had the random thought that if I were to take Nagato over to Cydia's place and leave her there, Cydia would probably dress her up in some hand-me-downs. I'd have to give that a try sometime. I wanted to ask Koizumi just what catalog he jumped out of. His winter jacket looked so sharp on him that you could have swapped him out for a department store mannequin, if you left out the part where he was holding 2 heavy-duty shovels. Asahina wore an inoffensive pair of pants along with an inoffensive down jacket. It occurred to me that outside of her school uniform, I'd never seen Asahina wear the same outfit twice. I made lunches for everyone. Maybe because she'd gotten totally in the picnicking spirit, Asahina's face was 100% charming as she held a large basket. I wanted to pretend I'd come along just to eat her homemade lunch. And yet, it was hard to believe that this Asahina would be half-worded by me to travel into the past. Had the other Asahina really been telling the truth? Is something wrong? Asahina looked up at me, her face uncertain. No, I answered casually. I was just thinking I'm looking forward to lunchtime. Don't get too excited about it, please. I really don't know if it'll be tasty or not. Her shyness was adorable, but my admiration was interrupted by the usual suspect. Lunches are well and good, said Haruhi, breaking my field of vision, but don't forget today's objective. We're not here to play around. This is a treasure hunt. We're not taking a lunch break until we've put in enough effort to deserve one. As Haruhi spoke, her smile was like the sun outshining the north wind or a child just about to go out and play. I wanted to tell her she needed to keep that smile on ready alert, but I stopped myself. When I thought about it, I realized that I'd stopped myself because that was Haruhi's usual expression. I'd been deceived by the bad mood she'd been in since the beginning of February. As to why I felt deceived, I had no idea. For once, the brigade didn't proceed to make a trip to the cafe at my expense. The trip wasn't canceled, though, just postponed. Haruhi informed me of this as she stood at the bus stop rotary in front of the train station, adding that at the next brigade function, I'd be treating everybody no matter who was last to arrive. Perhaps she was worried if we didn't start looking for treasure immediately, someone would beat us to it. Whatever the reason, she wanted to get to the mountain as soon as possible. Holding the shovel I'd been handed, I boarded the mountain-bound bus, standing beside Koizumi, who held on like a hanging strap. The two of us definitely stood out holding our shovels like that, but it couldn't be helped. The single saving grace was that there weren't many passengers bound for the mountains that day. We rattled around the bus for about half an hour. At our stop, Haruhi ordered us off the bus, and we found ourselves so surrounded by nature that the busy train station seemed like a dream. It was hard to believe that we were still in the same city, but thanks to many field trips I'd taken around this area in elementary and middle school, I was used to the scenery and wasn't actually all that surprised. If we headed north from here, we really would be climbing a mountain. Fortunately, Suriya's family mountain was smaller than that, although it was pretty surprising that such a place was someone's private property. That explained why I'd never climbed this particular mountain, even on a field trip. Seems like it'll be easier to climb from this side, said Haruhi, map in hand as she held the way. I exhaled white vapor as I looked up at the peak of Mount Surya. Okay, so I didn't know its real name, but let's stick with Mount Surya. We were exactly opposite the face I'd climbed the day before yesterday with Asahina. As to which route was the back way, it seemed like my earlier path was the likely candidate for that. The way Haruhi was now following a narrow path that zigzagged from the base of the mountain up to the summit. It would make for an easier hike, right? Kyon, this is no time to be staring up at the sky. Hurry up and walk. Haruhi's voice rang out, and I started to move my feet. Something had been nagging at me, but now it faded away. I know. I hefted the shovel and caught back up to the brigade. Aside from Haruhi, who was acting like a rabbit suddenly returning to the forest, there was Asahina, who seemed just like an elementary school student on a hiking field trip, Nagato, who was exactly the same as she always was, and Koizumi, wearing a vaguely serene smile. I had major doubts as to how many of these individuals were actually serious about finding treasure. I knew for a fact I wasn't serious, which explained my lack of energy. The fact that we'd dig and find nothing already got written in the personalized future schedule, and it got from me to Asahina. Under normal circumstances, since this was Haruhi we were talking about, there was every possibility we'd actually dig up treasure, but Asahina would never tell a stupid lie about the past, so it was certain we weren't going to find the secret treasure of Suriya's ancestor. Whatever is the matter? Koizumi walked alongside me, forcing a pleasant smile. You look as though you believe that everything we're doing is a complete waste of time. I stayed silent. I had nothing to say to this guy. Koizumi looked like he believed exactly the same thing. Like he knew that this was his job, whether we actually dug something up or not. He also seemed like he knew there was another Asahina in this time period, in which case I wanted him to come out and say it. Was he waiting for me to come and ask him for advice? If so, he was just going to have to keep waiting. Now that I had Surya for an accomplice, I didn't need his help. And I didn't feel like giving him any information either. People won't move the way you want them to if you just wait around. If you're not straight with them, they'll just get sick of you. Whatever he thought of my lack of an answer, Koizumi hefted his shovel and looked ahead. He kept his smile out of either tolerance or stoicism. Either way, he was the same old Koizumi. I found myself relieved for some reason, but in any case, I had to focus on mountain climbing now. Haruhi pushed through the thicket and pointed to the summit. First, we'll head to the peak. If I were going to bury treasure, I'd dig at the easiest spot to find. Surya's ancestor was a human too, after all. He'd obviously bury it somewhere easy to spot. If he wanted it to be easy to spot, why bury it at all? But Haruhi wanted to head to the top. That's why she was the SOS Brigade Chief. She was the master and commander of aliens, time travelers, espers, and she wanted to go to the top. Asahina was bent over and panting as she climbed. I wanted to give her a push from behind, but with Haruhi in the lead, there was no chance for me to do so. After about half an hour of that, we arrived at the peak. That seemed like longer than it should have taken, but the path seemed to have been made to require a minimum of effort on the part of its climbers, and without being conscious of heading particular steep slopes, we'd managed to conquer this small mountain. I wasn't especially tired, since the mountain itself wasn't more than a glorified hill. My walking endurance had been naturally increased from trudging up a hill to school every day. Unfortunately, what we were about to do would definitely tire me out. In other words, it was time to dig for treasure. Haruhi was now in her element. It should be somewhere around here, right? We started digging in the vague area Haruhi had gestured at. It seemed too obvious a spot to be hiding gold or treasure, and given that I knew there was nothing down there. After digging about 2 meters down, no shovel had impacted wood, or stone, or anything hard. All thanks to the discriminatory practice of delegating all excavation duties to males. The only ones digging were Koizumi and me. The 3 girls simply enjoyed a picnic, with Asahina being the only one who could be relied upon to cheer us on. Haruhi simply ordered us around. Next, over there! And Nagato had the same Buddha face she always had. It seemed likely that if I prayed to her, she'd tell me where the treasure could actually be found, but it would be very strange to strike gold on the first try, so I refrained from Nagato and directed entreaties. And anyway, it wouldn't be good if we actually found something. Thus, no matter how incredible Haruhi's ability to ignore reality was, even she would find it a bit strange to dig up buried treasure without any hard work at all. The problem was that only Koizumi and I were actually doing the hard work, and because Koizumi's pleasant expression seemed permanently carved in his face, I was the only one actually suffering. It was enough to make me want to try and talk Taniguchi and Kunakita into helping, but Haruhi put the kibosh on that. Listen, we're looking for buried treasure. Everybody has to get a share. I'm a fair brigade chief, so if I'm going to divide it up evenly, if we brought those jokers in, we'd have to split the treasure 7 ways. I'm not going to let it go to waste like that, got it? If we were actually going to find Genroku era gold coins, I would have agreed, but this map had come out of the depths of the Surya family storehouse. The Surya clan had thrived for hundreds of years, so it had definitely weathered some tough times. If an ancestor had buried treasure here, wouldn't their descendants have dug it up and used it at some point? The so-called treasure map had to be the scribbling left by one of the clan's heads, or else a grand prank at the expense of his descendants. My guess was that if we dug up anything at all, it'd be a piece of paper containing only the words, "Thou hast lost." For some reason, I got the feeling that Surya's ancestor had a lot of free time on his hands. Surya herself had even said as much. That's why she'd been happy to give Haruhi the map. I bet Surya would have done the same thing herself if she were in her ancestor's position, cackling all the while as she imagined her people in the future going to all this trouble because of her joke. She was definitely the type to get all people excited at first, then laugh at how exhausted they were. I wanted to warn them off, but I only managed to restrain my own desire, instead silently plunging my shovel into the earth. Our mountain wasn't a large one, so there wasn't a lot of space at the peak. As we kept digging, the area became full of holes. Koizumi and I labored mightily at Haruhi's urging, and unlike Koizumi, who was happy to play at being a mole man, I began to feel more and more oppressed. It was dangerous to just leave the holes we dug, so we also had doubly pointless work of shoveling the dug-up earth back into holes. I started to feel as though I'd been thrown back into some kind of inhuman labor camp. "Stop complaining and focus on the treasure." Haruhi sat cross-legged on a rolled-out map, giving directions with a triumphant smile, like some grand general addressing her army. To her right side knelt Nagato, who looked like a faithful page as she read her paperback, while to Haruhi's right sat Asahina, who huddled close to Haruhi as though trying to stay warm. "Kyon, you're working up enough of a sweat that you might think it's warm, but as you can see, it's pretty cold up here. If you don't hurry and find something, we're gonna freeze. Are you sure you're digging right?" I was digging just where she told me to. If she wanted to move around, she could do some digging of her own, I told her. Her arms around Haruhi, Asahina spoke in a tremulous voice. Should I help?" "No, don't bother," interrupted Haruhi before I could reply. "This is for Kyon's sake, too. It's good practice for construction work. If he doesn't get experience now, he's going to have a hard time later." I wasn't exactly grateful to receive career counseling from someone my own age, I said. "The day's going to come where you'll be glad you did this. That's how the world works. People should do everything they can." "You do it, then." "Hey, Haruhi," I said, wiping sweat off my forehead. "We're not going to find anything just digging random holes. I assume you're not planning to try and level the whole mountain. For one thing, we're not even sure if the treasure exists." "Yeah, and how do you know it doesn't? We might just not have found it yet." "Yeah, we haven't found it yet because it's not here. Let's first prove it exists, then start digging." Haruhi pursed her lips as though her eyes were smiling. This is that proof." In her hand, she held Surya's ancestral treasure map. "It says it's buried somewhere on this mountain, so it's gotta be here. I trust Surya's ancestor that much. It's gotta be here." Haruhi's face brimmed with eccentric confidence as she explained her strange reasoning. Her certainty made it sound like she'd seen the spot old Fuseman Surya had buried his treasure. "But you've got a point," she said, putting a finger to her chin. "It was hasty to assume it was buried at the peak. It would have been a pain to climb all the way to the top, so maybe it's on a lower spot. Yeah, I definitely want it to be buried in a more interesting spot than this." Haruhi extracted herself from Asahina's arms and then stood, putting her shoes back on. "We need to look for a likelier spot. Until then, Kyon, dig over there." Upon issuing my new orders, Haruhi headed off into the brush, making a rustling sound as she proceeded in roughly the opposite direction from which we climbed. Silently, I watched her go, assuming my sense of direction wasn't mistaken. If she kept going, she'd come across a flat spot halfway down the mountainside, where she'd find the gourd steep stone, a marker that practically shouted, "Dig here!" It was all good and well to do as I was told and dig, but eventually got sick of it and tossed the shovel aside, leaving Koizumi to fill the hole back up. I sat down on the mat. "Here," said Asahina, offering me a paper cup of hot tea. It was the most nutritious thing that I could imagine. It was sweet, a sweetness that suited Asahina herself perfectly. Asahina held her silver thermos carefully and smiled as she watched me tentatively sip at the brown liquid. "It's lovely weather today, isn't it? And such a nice view." Her eyes looked far off into the distance, to the south, where the world spread out before us. Our far-off city was hazy with distance, and beyond that was the sea. The mountain wind whistled fiercely, and Asahina shivered. "It would have been nicer to come in the springtime. February's so cold," she said in a lonely voice, even as she kept a soft smile, looking down at the dreary view. "This would be a nicer place if the flowers were blooming." "We'll come then," I told her, "to see the blossoms. Give it a couple more months, and this cold air mass will have to have warmed right up." "Oh, that would be lovely. Blossom watching. I'd love to try that." Asahina held her knees. "That would be in April. I'll be a senior by then." That was true. In all likelihood, I'd be a junior, and Asahina would be a senior as she advanced. She wasn't going to repeat a year, right? I asked her. "No, I'll be fine," she said with a sigh. "But sometimes I think it would be nice to just do my junior year over, because then I'd be in the same year as Kyon and everybody else. Right now, I'm the only one who's ahead, but I don't feel like an upperclassman at all. She had absolutely no reason to worry about that. It had been Haruhi who said we needed a baby-faced, petite, sexy mascot and forced her into the club, and Haruhi who'd broke no complaint on the matter. If she'd wanted Asahina to be in the same year, she would have totally ignored any protest from Asahina and forced her to repeat a year or fail a class or something. For my part, I told her, I was satisfied if she just kept being the SOS Brigade's maid. Asahina giggled. Thank you. Perhaps taking notice of Nagato reading nearby, she lowered her voice. I hope I can be just a little more worthwhile this year. Just as I was experiencing a spastic desire to run my mouth about the other Asahina, the sound of rustling underbrush announced Haruhi's return. What, you're taking a break already? I didn't want to hear any complaints, I said. I had already been working for nearly 2 hours. Heh, fine, I'm getting pretty hungry myself. Haruhi seemed happy about something as she trotted over. Come on, Mikuru, let's have lunch. Okay. The sight of Asahina opening the picnic basket was a fine one indeed. The handmade sandwiches, rice balls, and side dishes she took out were the real treasure as far as I was concerned. It wasn't an overstatement to say this was the reason I'd come along. Nagato silently closed the book she was reading and looked intently at Asahina's handiwork. Koizumi stuck the shovel into the soft earth of the hole he had just filled and walked over. That looks truly delicious, he said by way of his initial impression. Of course it looks delicious. You went exercising, Haruhi butted in, filling her own paper cup from the thermos, then raising the cup into the air. Well then, here's to hopes for successful treasure hunting. Now our trip seemed like a real picnic. If you ignored Koizumi and my dirty clothes, that was. I looked sideways as I stuffed my face with a seaweed rice ball. From what I could tell, Haruhi was enjoying her lunch with such gusto, it seemed like she'd forgotten all about the treasure hunt. I would have expected her to have gotten frustrated with Koizumi and my failing to dig up anything interesting, grabbed a shovel, and started digging around herself, but she'd been strangely happy all day, almost as if going on a hike and eating lunch under the blue sky had been her goal all along. Haruhi's actions lately had been just as incomprehensible as Asahina the Elder's future transmissions. She turned suddenly melancholy, then decided it was time for bean tossing, and then, just when I thought she'd calm down again, here we were on a treasure hunt. It's fine, though. Compared with getting sucked into some stupid dimension filled with celestials, or having cherry blossoms bloom in autumn, it was like the difference between taking a trip to the moon or the Andromeda Nebula. Give me the moon any day of the week. One was a heavenly body on which humans had actually walked, and the other was an undiscovered frontier you'd have to use a galactic railroad to get to. There was a huge difference. Of course, I'd already experienced both closed space and identified falling blossoms. Enjoying lunch in the mountain with all 5 of us was actually very nice. Nagato wasn't hesitating to dig right in, I noticed with relief, and she seemed very much herself. Haruhi seemed brimming with energy, and Koizumi was the usual Koizumi. Asahina was fine too, although when it came to her, I knew there was another version holed up at Tsurio's place, which made it really hard for me to feel at ease. Hey, Kyon, if we do find treasure, what are you going to do with your share? Asked Haruhi, her mouth full of cutlet sandwich. I had fantasies like that all the time, so it was an easy question to answer. I'm going to cash it in and buy a new game system, all the games I wanted to play, then go to the used bookstore and buy back all the manga my mom made me sell off, and then save the rest. You make it sound like it's your allowance. You gotta dream bigger than that. Haruhi gulped down the sandwich with a flash and regarded me with a pitying smile. So what would she do? I demanded. I don't really care about money, so even if we do find the kind of treasure we'd be able to sell off, I don't think I'd do it. I mean, we went to all that trouble to get it, right? I'd lock it up for a while, then bury it again somewhere. Don't you think leaving a treasure map for your own descendants would be worth more than just plain old money? Sure, a childish treasure hunt was fun and all, but I wasn't so overflowing with allowance I'd use it that way. If we found something useful, I'd happily keep it for myself, but if I didn't need it, I'd rather just throw it away than take the trouble to bury it, I said. Oh, you're no fun, said Haruhi, her lips pursed in exasperation, but then she smiled. I guess if you're just going to blow it all on pointless stuff like that, I hope you can find something you can't exchange for money. Right, Mikuru? Interrupted mid-bite, Asahina looked back and forth hesitantly as she simultaneously tried to set down her half-eaten lunch and cover her chewing mouth politely with her hand. Yes, I guess. Wait, no. I mean, maybe that would make everybody happier, or... She trailed off as her eyes met Haruhi's and mine in turn. She waved her hands frantically. I just hope we can find some treasure. Oh, we'll find some treasure. I know these things. Haruhi made her usual baseless assertions as she stuffed her face with a sandwich. Nagato sat on Matt's corner, demolishing her lunch as though wanting to best Haruhi. Beside her was Koizumi, down on one knee like a pop idol, posing for a teeny bopper magazine. He noticed my gaze and tipped his cup slightly, smiling wordlessly at Asahina, watched the lunch she prepared to get taken care of by Haruhi and Nagato. For just a moment, I wasn't thinking about the letters from the future or the other Asahina hiding out at Tsuruya's house. I was just enjoying having a fun picnic lunch with everybody. Despite the unseasonal hike and pointless treasure hunt, looking at the high-spirited Haruhi, the thankfully normal Nagato, along with Asahina and Koizumi being their usual selves, for a little while I felt like everything was going to be okay. No, everything had to be okay.